I'm Chance Storland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Elizabeth, great to have you back. We are going to talk about two cases that we've discussed previously here on the podcast that both ended in guilty verdicts. Tell me first about the wrap-up of the trial for Daniel Moreno Lopez.
Last week, there were some big cases in Bexar County, two of them, as you mentioned. One of them was a case that we've talked about before, Daniel Moreno Lopez. As you probably remember, he went to trial last year. He and two other co-defendants were accused of murdering Jose Luis Menchaca, who was 35 years old. And this killing allegedly was in retaliation for Menchaca stabbing Lopez in the back 2 days before Menchaca died on September 30th, 2014. Well, this trial got completed this year, finally, and the courtroom erupted in chaos after the jury found Lopez guilty of murder in this horrific killing. Now, again, Menchaca was beaten with 2 aluminum baseball bats. He was suffocated, he was dismembered, and his arms and his legs were grilled on a barbecue pit. So it was a really interesting thing. It took the jury about 3 hours to reach a verdict in this case. And pretty much during the trial, Lopez had maintained some sort of calmness to himself. There were times when he seemed agitated, but as soon as the jury came back with their verdict, his new girlfriend said, "Babe," and I think it was probably one of these things where she saw that there was something about to happen. So he began flailing and fighting with the deputies, and I believe that Judge Ron Rangel expected that something was going to happen, because before the verdict was read to the gallery, you saw at least 10 Bexar County Sheriff's deputies come into the courtroom. There were several that were surrounding the table where J. Charles Bunk, Lopez's attorney, was sitting, along with his co-counsel, Kelly McGinnis. And they just basically surrounded that area, and when Judge Rangel received the verdict from the jury foreman and read it aloud was when all of this commotion began to take place.
And Elizabeth, would you say that type of presence was abnormal, or at least not typical for a murder trial?
You know, you see it, Chance, sometimes. You see it whenever you can kind of feel, some sort of tension and electricity in the courtroom. I've covered a couple of cases, and the next one that we're going to talk about, pretty much the same thing. When you see that there's family members on both sides that maybe kind of have that propensity to react in some way, you'll see a larger presence of sheriff deputies come in. So once this happened with Lopez, it took about 8 of those deputies to pretty much shove him through a door where inmates are kept whenever they are on trial. And while this was happening, his girlfriend and his mother and an aunt, and the woman who is the aunt, I believe, is actually Gabriel Moreno's mother. Gabriel Moreno is Lopez's cousin and a co-defendant in this case. Well, the mother and the aunt and the girlfriend actually ran out of the courtroom, and Lopez's mother began wailing and screaming, and she threw herself on the floor in the hallway and was just inconsolable. It took the 2 women a lot to try to get her under control, and she ran down the hallway and ran down the stairs screaming the words, "No, no." So it was a very emotional time in the courtroom. And this was, a pretty horrific case, for Bexar County standards. I mean, this began again as a drug deal, and it went bad, and then there was retaliation and the stabbing, which hurt Daniel Lopez, but it didn't warrant a hospital stay. Police had been called, but there was never really any explanation during the trial as to how there were no charges brought against Menchaca in that particular stabbing. So that case has come to an end for at least one of the defendants. Gabriel Moreno, of course, went to trial a couple of months ago in March, and the trial was completed, but it did end in a mistrial because the jury could not decide after 4 days of deliberations whether he was guilty or innocent. So the next person that we are anxious to hear about is the other co-defendant, Candy Dominguez, who was Daniel Lopez's girlfriend. Since they have been incarcerated, Daniel has a new girlfriend who was at his trial. So we will await to see what happens with Candy Dominguez and with Gabriel Moreno. Both of those cases are attached to Judge Ron Rangel's courtroom, which is the 379th State District Court.
And then, Liz, we still have plenty of time left, talking now about another Bexar County murder trial that has ended. Tell me about this other murder conviction.
Yes, Chance. This case was going on around the same time as the Daniel Lopez trial was going on, so it was very, very well covered by my colleague Bruce Selcraig. He is a very good backup for me. I really appreciate him, especially when there's two really high-profile cases going on, which we had last week in Bexar County. So this is the trial of Andira Abdelaziz. She's 37 years old, and she was convicted of killing Mohammed Abdelaziz, who was 25. Now, he was her nephew by marriage, with whom she had secretly had an affair that had been going on for a couple of years. This was a very emotional trial also, and it was also very different because culturally, that is, because Andira and Mohammed are Palestinian Americans, and the family dynamic is such where Andira is in an arranged marriage. She married her husband at probably 14 or 15 years old, I believe. And at some point, she began having this affair with her nephew by marriage, who had been invited to the house to watch after the Abdelaziz family by his uncle, who had gone to Jerusalem to visit family members. So this trial lasted about 2 weeks in the 226 State District Court, which is presided by Judge Sid Harrell. And this is an interesting case because Andira, and I'm going to use first names since they have the same last names, Andira had said that she killed Mohammed because she was getting beaten by him. Now, when she was arrested, she had a black eye, and what was argued in court the day that I covered opening statements was that she did not tell authorities that day that the stabbing occurred that she had been beaten by her nephew. And at that point, no one knew of the affair. So, and this is a case that happened. Mohammed was killed on August 9th, 2016. And when Andira was arrested, again, she talked about being afraid. She never said to authorities that there had been abuse that went on that day. So one could assume that, prosecutors, Clayton Hayden and Sadeh Mitchell argued that, if no one really argued that there was no abuse that was going on. However, on the day that she was arrested, they said that she did not make that outcry. So the trial went on. She testified on her own behalf and talked about just the shame that would have gone to her family had they found out about the affair, and also the fact that she was worried that she might become a victim of an honor killing. So it had a lot of different components that a regular court watcher in Bexar County may not particularly understand much. But in the end, the jury decided that she was guilty. And then her defense attorneys, Mike McCrum and Lisa Rodriguez, argued to the jury that she reacted out of sudden passion. Now, sudden passion is a defense that reduces the possible sentence from 5 to 99 years or life in prison for a murder conviction, which is a first-degree felony. Sudden passion actually reduces that possible sentence to a range of 2 to 20 years. So, Chance, it took the jury less than 2 hours to decide on the minimum sentence for Andira Abdelaziz. They gave her 2 years in prison.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. And Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, that's not something that we're completely unfamiliar with here on The Docket.
No, actually, we have discussed this before, and this is very similar to the Frances Hall conviction. Now, Frances Hall, as you know, was convicted 2 years ago almost. In September, it'll be 2 years. And she was convicted of murder in the death of her husband, Bill Hall Jr. He owned a trucking company in San Antonio. In fact, they both did. He and his wife built this company together. And they were involved in a three-way chase down a highway. And at some point, either Frances Hall bumped her husband, who was on a motorcycle, as she's chasing her husband's lover in a vehicle owned by the Halls, or her husband, in trying to stop the chase on the highway, lost control and hit the Escalade that his wife was driving. But in that case, the jury convicted her of murder, likely because testimony revealed that nobody ever stopped once Bill Hall hit the ground. So, but then the jury came back after listening to just very tearful testimony with Frances Hall when she testified in the punishment phase of her trial, that, how much she loved her husband. She was, temporarily didn't realize what was going on and had no idea that he had fallen and, died from those injuries. So in that case also, it didn't take the jury very long to come back with a sentence of 2 years, also with the sudden passion defense. So yes, very, very similar. We now have, 2 cases in Bexar County where women have been convicted of murder. Frances Hall of her husband, and Andira Abdelaziz in her nephew in the killing of her nephew by marriage, who was also her lover. And both of these women received the lightest sentence possible for killing those 2 men. In contrast, years ago, there was a case where a woman by the name of Clara Harris ran over her husband several times. He had been having an affair, and she ran over him several times in a parking lot of the dental office that they both worked at. And it was caught on video. She was convicted of murder, but the jury in that case, also considering sudden passion, gave her the maximum of 20 years. And I believe that was close to 10 years ago. I believe that she has already been released from prison, having served half of that time. So very interesting cases that have happened recently in Bexar County.
And then, so of course, a lot of times when a murder conviction is involved, there's often an appeal, especially when there's a death sentence. But that's not the case, at least so far, for either of the cases that we've discussed today. Could you just generally talk about where do we go now with these convictions for Daniel Moreno Lopez and Andira Abdelaziz?
Well, each conviction, the defendant always has the right to appeal their cases. And what's interesting as well, there is, in the Frances Hall case, at least, she's got one of her defense attorneys has asked for a retrial because they have accused co-counsel during this trial of not bringing forth experts to refute certain testimony from experts that the state had, that they believe that this one particular defense attorney of Frances Hall's, Adam Cortez, believes that she would have gotten a not guilty on that case. Now, they're still actually moving forward to try to ask the court to do a retrial on this case, but she is due to be out in September. So that would be, we've talked about this case before. That would be a little bit of a situation. I mean, what do you do? Do you end up going back to trial with the thought that maybe, you might not get a sudden passion defense this time, or you may not still for the second time get a guilty verdict, or you may not get the not guilty verdict. So that's an interesting thing that we're still watching. I believe at the end of August we'll find out more about that Frances Hall case. But as far as the Abdelaziz case, she's able to get her attorneys to appeal that conviction, and it'll go up and it'll get reviewed, to see what happens in that case. The same thing for Daniel Lopez. We'll be looking actually to see how soon, maybe this year, we could see Gabriel Moreno come back and to see what actually happens with Candy Dominguez, because she's not really had her day in court yet. So, there's always that option to appeal, yes.
And of course, more information about all the cases that we've mentioned so far in today's edition of the Docket Podcast, available online at expressnews.com. So, Elizabeth Zavala, the courts reporter for the San Antonio Express News, as always, great to have you here on the program, and we'll speak to you again soon.
It's great to be here, Chance. Take care.
And a big thanks to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Storland.